"You worthless piece of trash," my husband Marcus snarled into his phone, thinking I was still deployed overseas. "She's got nothing left. The disability checks barely cover groceries, and she's too proud to ask her dead parents for help." He laughed, a cold sound that made my blood freeze as I stood hidden in our kitchen doorway, still in my desert camouflage from the surprise homecoming I'd planned. 3 more months of this charade, and I'll have cleaned out everything. The house, her savings, even that pathetic veteran's compensation. Then I'm gone, and she can figure out how to survive on her own. What Marcus didn't know was that in exactly 72 hours on my 30th birthday, the Blackwood family trust would transfer complete control to me. $300 million that had been waiting for the right heir since my great-great-grandfather built his railroad empire across the American West in the 1880s. My husband thought he'd married a broken soldier with barely enough money to survive. He had no idea he'd declared war on one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Montana. By the time I walked through that front door and let him see my face, I already knew exactly how I was going to destroy him, and I was going to use every single penny of that fortune to make sure he paid for what he'd done to me and the other women whose lives he'd ruined. The fluorescent overhead light in our cramped kitchen cast harsh shadows as I stood there in my combat boots, my duffel bag still slung over my shoulder, listening to my husband of 2 years discuss my financial destruction with the casual indifference of someone planning their grocery list. The 12-hour flight from Kandahar to Seattle had been exhausting, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins now made me feel more alert than I'd been in months. "The PTSD thing is perfect cover," Marcus continued, his voice carrying that smooth confidence that had first attracted me when we'd met at a veterans support meeting in Tacoma. "Nobody questions why a damaged soldier might make poor financial decisions. Hell, I've already got her convinced that her nightmares are affecting her judgment. Last week, she signed over power of attorney for the investment accounts without even reading the paperwork," a woman's voice responded, tinny through his phone speaker, but I couldn't make out the words. The tone, though, was calculating, predatory. I'd heard that same tone from insurgents planning ambushes in Afghanistan, the sound of people who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited. "How much have you managed to extract so far?" the voice asked, clearer now as Marcus moved, closer to the kitchen island where I stood hidden. "Everything liquid," Marcus replied with satisfaction. "About $47,000 from her personal accounts, plus another $15,000 from the joint savings we opened after the wedding. The VA disability payments go straight into an account she thinks we both control, but I've been siphoning those off for months." The numbers hit me like physical blows. $47,000. That was my deployment savings, money I'd set, aside by living in bare-bones conditions for 15 months in one of the most dangerous forward operating bases in Afghanistan. Money I'd planned to use for college when I finally got my head straight, when the nightmares stopped coming every night, when I could sit in a classroom without scanning for exit routes and improvised explosive devices. "What about the family? Money?" the woman's voice pressed. "You said there was a trust fund." Marcus's footsteps moved away from the kitchen island, and I heard the sliding door to our back patio open. The October evening air was cold enough that I could see his breath as he continued the conversation outside, apparently wanting more privacy for this particular topic. "That's where it gets interesting, Sarah," he said, using a name I'd never heard before. "The trust doesn't activate until she turns 30, which is this Friday. But here's the beautiful part. If she dies before then, or if she's declared mentally incompetent, the money reverts to distant cousins she's never met. No inheritance for a dead soldier." Sarah. The name sent ice through my veins colder than any Afghan winter I'd endured. I'd heard Marcus mention a Sarah before, always in the context of business consulting or financial planning. Now I understood what kind of business they were really conducting. "Are you sure the psychological angle will work?" Sarah's voice carried notes of impatience and professional skepticism. "We can't afford another recovery situation like what happened with Jennifer in Portland. 6 months of her fighting the commitment proceedings before the overdose finally Took her. Jennifer. Another name. Another woman. My mind raced even as my body remained frozen in the doorway. How many of us had there been? How many female veterans had Marcus targeted, manipulated, and destroyed? The combat training that had kept me alive through 3 deployments kicked in automatically. Assess the threat. Gather intelligence. Plan your response. Execute with overwhelming force. But this wasn't a battlefield in Afghanistan where I could call in air support or rely on my squad for backup. This was my own home, and the enemy was the man I'd trusted with my heart, my body, and apparently, my financial destruction. The PTSD diagnosis from the VA makes everything easier, Marcus replied with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this before. Dr. Morrison's been documenting her deteriorating mental state for months. Paranoid episodes, financial irresponsibility, inability to make sound decisions. By the time the trust would activate, there won't be anyone competent left to activate it for. Dr. Morrison, my own therapist, the man I'd been seeing twice a week to deal with the aftermath of watching my convoy hit an IED outside Kabul. The man I'd trusted with my deepest fears, my worst memories, my desperate hope that someday I might feel normal again. He was part of this conspiracy, using my trauma as a weapon against me. The sliding door closed with a soft thud, and Marcus's footsteps approached the kitchen again. I had perhaps 30 seconds before he'd walk around the corner and discover me standing there. 30 seconds to decide how to play this, how to gather more information without revealing that I knew about their plan. The Blackwood Family Trust. Even I had barely thought about it seriously in the chaos of my military service and subsequent struggles with readjustment. It had seemed like something distant, almost mythical, a family legend that my grandmother had mentioned occasionally but never in concrete terms. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Blackwood, had built the Northern Mountain Railroad through some of the most treacherous terrain in the American West during the 1880s. What had started as a single rail line connecting mining camps in Montana had eventually become a transportation empire spanning 7 states. When he died in 1923, he'd established the trust with a specific provision. It would remain untouched, growing and compounding, until a direct Blackwood descendant reached the age of 30 and demonstrated the maturity and wisdom to handle such enormous responsibility. My parents had died in a military transport crash when I was 22, making me the sole remaining direct descendant. The trust had seemed like something I'd worry about when I reached middle age, if I survived that long. I'd been too focused on my military career, on serving my country, on dealing with the psychological aftermath of war, to give serious thought to inherited wealth. But Marcus had clearly done his research. He'd known about the trust when he'd targeted me at that veterans meeting 2 years ago. Every moment of our relationship had been calculated, choreographed, designed to position him perfectly for the biggest theft of his criminal career. The refrigerator hummed to life, and I heard Marcus moving around the kitchen, probably getting himself a beer to celebrate another successful day of financially destroying his wife. I had to make a choice: confront him now, or gather more intelligence about the scope of their operation. Training won out over emotion. In Afghanistan, rushing into a situation without proper reconnaissance got people killed. I needed to understand exactly what I was facing before I revealed my hand. But one thing was absolutely certain. Marcus had chosen his final victim. He just didn't know it yet. Quietly backing away from the kitchen doorway, I made my way upstairs to what had once been our bedroom but now felt like enemy territory. Every familiar object, the framed photo from our wedding, the dresser where I kept my few civilian clothes, the bed where I'd shared 2 years of my life with a man who saw me as nothing more than a financial target, suddenly looked different, through the lens of betrayal. My hands moved automatically through the motions I'd learned in military intelligence training. Check for surveillance devices, secure communication channels, assess available resources. The small voice recorder I'd carried throughout my deployment was still in my go bag, along with the encrypted phone the Army had issued for sensitive communications. Old habits from forward operating bases where operational security meant the difference between life and death. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my desert camouflage in this suburban Washington house, my mind wasn't focused on tradecraft. It was racing backward through 2 years of what I'd believed was genuine love, searching for the signs I'd missed, the moments when Marcus's mask had slipped. We'd met at a veterans transition workshop in Tacoma, one of those well-meaning programs designed to help returning soldiers adapt to civilian life. I'd been struggling with everything: sleep, crowds, loud noises, the constant feeling that danger lurked around every corner. The facilitator had paired us up for a trust exercise, and Marcus had seemed to understand my hypervigilance in a way that most civilians couldn't. I was never deployed, he'd told me during our first coffee date. But my brother served 2 tours in Iraq. I watched what he went through coming home, how hard it was for him to readjust. You don't have to explain everything to me, Samantha. I get it. The lie had been perfect because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Marcus did have a brother, and that brother had served in Iraq. What I didn't know then was that Marcus had been using his brother's military experience as research, learning the vocabulary and emotional patterns he'd need to manipulate female veterans like me. Looking back now, I could see how carefully he'd constructed every interaction. The way he'd always suggested restaurants with booth seating that put my back to a wall. His patience when I'd wake up screaming from nightmares about improvised explosive devices. The gentle way he'd encouraged me to talk about my financial concerns, my fears about transitioning to civilian employment, my worry about being a burden on anyone. "You're not a burden, Sam," he'd whispered during one of our early dates, using the nickname that made me feel like someone saw past the damaged soldier to the woman underneath. "You're a hero who deserves to be taken care of for once. Let me help carry some of that weight." The courtship had moved quickly, but not in a way that raised red flags. Marcus had explained his urgency by talking about how much his brother regretted waiting too long to settle down after his deployment. "Life's too short," he'd said when he proposed after 8 months of dating. "When you've seen what war can do to people, you learn not to waste time when you find something real." I'd said yes without hesitation, desperate for the stability and connection he offered. After years of military bases and deployment rotations, the idea of having a permanent home with someone who understood my struggles felt like salvation. The wedding had been small, reflecting what Marcus had called our shared preference for privacy over spectacle. Just a handful of friends, his parents who'd flown in from Oregon, and a simple ceremony at a courthouse in Seattle. I'd been touched by how considerate he was about my family situation. No awkward questions about why my parents weren't there, no pressure to invite relatives I barely knew. Now I realized it hadn't been consideration. It had been operational security. Fewer witnesses meant fewer people who might ask difficult questions later. Our first year of marriage had felt like everything I'd hoped for. Marcus had encouraged me to take my time transitioning to civilian employment, assuring me that his consulting business provided enough income for both of us. He'd been patient with my therapy appointments, supportive during my worst PTSD episodes, and understanding about my need for space when the nightmares got bad. "Focus on healing," he'd said, whenever I worried about contributing financially. Money will work itself out. What matters is getting you healthy." But gradually, subtly, he'd begun introducing ideas about financial planning and asset management. Questions about my military savings, suggestions about consolidating our accounts for tax efficiency, concerns about my ability to make sound financial decisions while dealing with trauma symptoms. "I'm not questioning your judgment, Sam," he'd explained when I'd hesitated about giving him access to my deployment savings. "I'm just worried that you're putting too much pressure on yourself. Let me handle the boring financial stuff while you focus on recovery." The power of attorney documents had been presented as a temporary measure just until I felt more stable. "It's not that I don't trust you to make good decisions," Marcus had assured me. "It's that I want to protect you from having to make any decisions at all until you're ready." Each step had seemed reasonable in isolation. It was only now, with the full picture revealed, that I could see how methodically he'd dismantled my financial independence while making it seem like he was protecting me. The joint savings account we'd opened had been his idea, sold as a symbol of our commitment to building a future together. I'd contributed my military pay and VA benefits, watching the balance grow and feeling proud that we were building something stable together. What I hadn't realized was that Marcus had been systematically withdrawing money while showing me falsified statements that made it appear our savings were growing. The investment accounts had been the final piece of his plan. "Your military savings should be working harder for you," he'd explained, pulling out charts and projections that showed how mutual funds and stock portfolios could multiply my nest egg. "I've been researching this for months, Sam. I want to make sure you're financially secure for the rest of your life." I'd signed the transfer paperwork during one of my worst weeks, when the nightmares had been so severe that I could barely function during daylight hours. Marcus had brought the documents to me along with hot soup and medication for a headache, positioning himself as the caring husband who was handling practical matters while I dealt with my trauma. "Don't even worry about reading all this legal language," he'd said gently. "It's just standard investment transfer forms. I've already reviewed everything with the financial advisor." The financial advisor who was probably another accomplice. How deep did this conspiracy go? How many people had been involved in the systematic destruction of my financial security? But they'd all made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that my military background made me vulnerable, that my PTSD symptoms indicated weakness and poor judgment. They had no idea that 3 deployments in Afghanistan had taught me skills they couldn't even imagine. More importantly, they'd completely failed to research the full extent of the Blackwood family legacy. They knew about the trust's existence, but they clearly had no understanding of what it really represented or what resources came with it. The Blackwood fortune hadn't been built by people who surrendered when threatened. My great-great-grandfather had survived claim jumpers, railroad wars, and financial panics that destroyed lesser men. The family had faced down robber barons, corrupt politicians, and hostile takeovers, always emerging stronger and more determined. Now Marcus and his accomplices were about to learn what happened when you targeted the wrong family. The sound of Marcus's footsteps on the stairs sent me into immediate tactical mode. I slipped into the walk-in closet, positioning myself behind hanging clothes where I could observe without being seen, and activated the voice recorder in my pocket. If I was going to bring down whatever operation he was running, I needed evidence. That would hold up in court. Marcus entered the bedroom talking on his phone, his voice carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who believed himself completely safe. "No, Sarah, I'm telling you the timing is perfect. She's not supposed to be back from deployment for another 3 weeks. That gives us plenty of time to complete the psychological evaluation and get the incompetency declaration filed before her birthday." He moved to the dresser where he kept his laptop, and I watched him power it up while continuing his conversation. From my concealed position, I could see the screen clearly as he opened what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet titled S. Blackwood Asset Analysis. "The VA therapist confirmed she's been having increasingly severe episodes," Marcus continued, scrolling through columns of numbers that represented my entire financial life. "Memory lapses, paranoid thinking, inability to concentrate on basic tasks. Dr. Morrison's report paints a picture of someone who's completely incapable of managing complex financial decisions." My hands clenched into fists as I listened to them. Discuss my mental health like it was a business asset to be leveraged. Dr. Morrison hadn't been documenting genuine symptoms. He'd been manufacturing a fictional narrative designed to steal my inheritance. Every session where I'd opened up about my struggles, every moment of vulnerability I'd shared in therapy, had been weaponized against me. "What about the family history research?" Sarah's voice asked through the phone speaker. "Have you confirmed The trust activation requirements? Marcus clicked to another tab, revealing what looked like a genealogical chart of the Blackwood family tree. Red X marks appeared over most of the names, including my parents. Only my name remained unmarked, with Target, 30th birthday 1015, written in bold letters beside it. It's airtight, Marcus replied with satisfaction. Samuel Blackwood established the trust in 1923 with very specific succession requirements. Direct descendant, minimum age 30, demonstrated mental competency. If Samantha dies or is declared incompetent before Friday, the entire $300 million reverts to distant cousins who don't even know they're related to the family. $300 million. Even knowing about the trust's existence, hearing the actual number spoken aloud hit me like a physical blow. That was more money than I could have comprehended during my years of eating MREs in Afghanistan or worrying about whether my VA benefits would cover basic living expenses. And after the reversion? Sarah pressed. That's where it gets beautiful, Marcus said, opening another document that appeared to be some kind of legal filing. The cousins are scattered. Across the country, most of them lower-middle-class families with no knowledge of their Blackwood connection. They'll be completely overwhelmed when lawyers contact them about a massive inheritance and very susceptible to guidance from helpful financial advisors who offer to manage the windfall for them. I felt sick as the full scope of their plan became clear. They weren't just targeting me. They were planning to defraud multiple innocent families by exploiting their inexperience with large-scale wealth management. How many people would lose their life-changing inheritances to this scheme? The Portland operation proved the model works perfectly, Marcus continued, and I caught a glimpse of another spreadsheet tab labeled J. Chen, Portland Analysis. Jennifer? Chen's cousins were so grateful for professional guidance that they signed management agreements, giving us control of 60% of their inherited assets. Within 18 months, we'd extracted $43 million while making it look like legitimate investment losses. Jennifer Chen. The woman Sarah had mentioned earlier. The one who'd fought the commitment proceedings for 6 months before dying, of an overdose. They'd murdered her, stolen her inheritance, and then systematically robbed her surviving family members of their rightful legacy. How many more targets do we have identified? Sarah asked, and I heard the rustle of papers through the phone. 12 confirmed for the next 2 years, Marcus replied, scrolling through what appeared to be a database of wealthy individuals. 3 more female veterans with family trusts activating in the next 18 months. 2 elderly widows with substantial estates and no close family. 4 business owners going through divorce proceedings that will leave them financially vulnerable. We're looking at potential gross acquisitions of over $2 billion if we execute everything correctly. $2 billion. This wasn't just a local operation targeting me. It was a nationwide network of financial predators who specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerable, wealthy individuals. They'd turned theft and murder into a systematic business model, complete with target analysis, operational timelines, and profit projections. Marcus clicked to yet another tab, this one showing what looked like an organizational chart. Names and photos were arranged in a hierarchy with Sarah Morrison at the top labeled as Operational Director. Below her were regional coordinators in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Denver, and Miami. Under each coordinator were teams of what appeared to be field operatives, medical professionals, and legal specialists. Dr. Morrison wants to accelerate the timeline, Sarah said, her voice taking on a more urgent tone. He's concerned about maintaining the psychological evaluation facade if Samantha has any more lucid periods. Can we move the incompetency hearing to Thursday? Thursday. That was tomorrow. Less than 24 hours before my 30th birthday and the trust activation. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent based on falsified medical records, steal my inheritance, and then probably arrange for my death to prevent any future legal challenges. But Marcus hesitated, and I could see him frowning at something on his laptop screen. There's been a complication, he said slowly. I just got an alert from our surveillance contact at Seattle-Tacoma International. Samantha's flight landed 3 hours ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the phone, I could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded like rapid typing on a keyboard. "Are you certain?" Sarah's voice had gone cold and professional. "She's not supposed to be back from Afghanistan until November." Flight manifest shows Staff Sergeant Samantha Blackwood returning from Kandahar via military transport, Marcus read from his screen. "She should have been here hours ago, but she hasn't come home yet." I watched him stand up and move toward the bedroom window, pulling the curtain aside to scan the street below. "Her car's not in the driveway. Maybe she went to the base first, or stopped somewhere to decompress before coming home." "This changes everything," Sarah said, and I could hear the sound of her moving around rapidly. "If she's back early, we need to assume she might have overheard something or become suspicious. Execute the contingency protocol immediately." "Which protocol?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Emergency termination. Make it look like a PTSD suicide. The psychological profile Dr. Morrison has been building will support that narrative perfectly. Returning veteran, struggling with reintegration, access to weapons, history of depression and anxiety. It's actually cleaner than the incompetency route." My blood turned to ice as I listened to them casually discuss murdering me. Not just stealing my money, but ending my life with the same cold professionalism they'd applied to targeting my finances. How many other women had heard similar conversations in their final hours? "I need time to set it up properly," Marcus said, moving back to his laptop. "If we're changing from psychological manipulation to direct termination, I need to make sure the scene will pass forensic examination." "You have until midnight," Sarah replied firmly. "Every hour she's back increases the risk of exposure. And Marcus, make sure you check her gear. If she's carrying any recording devices or communication equipment from her deployment, that needs to disappear before the authorities arrive." Recording devices. My hand moved instinctively to the voice recorder in my pocket, which had been capturing every word of this conversation. They had no idea that their entire murder plot was being documented in real time. Marcus closed his laptop and moved toward the door. "I'm going to check the garage, see if she's been home already. If her gear is here, I'll know how much time I have to work with." As his footsteps retreated down the stairs, I remained frozen in the closet, my mind racing through options. I had evidence of their conspiracy, but I was also trapped in a house with a man who was actively planning to kill me within the next few hours. My military training had prepared me for combat situations, but this was different. I was alone, in unfamiliar tactical terrain, facing an enemy who knew my routines and psychological vulnerabilities. But they'd made one crucial error in their planning. They'd assumed that my PTSD and military trauma made me weak and vulnerable. They had no idea that 3 combat deployments had also made me extremely dangerous when cornered. More importantly, they still had no understanding of what the Blackwood family legacy really meant. The trust wasn't just money. It was a comprehensive network of resources, connections, and capabilities that had been built over generations to protect family interests. In 18 hours, that network would be at my disposal. But first, I had to survive until midnight without letting Marcus know I was aware of his plans. The real war was just beginning. The sound of Marcus rummaging through the garage below gave me perhaps 10 minutes to act before he discovered that my deployment gear wasn't there, because I was still wearing most of it. My combat boots, tactical vest, and the small equipment pouches that held everything from my encrypted phone to emergency medical supplies were all still on my person, invisible beneath the civilian jacket I'd thrown on during my layover in Germany. Moving. With the silent precision I'd learned during night reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan, I slipped out of the closet and made my way to the guest bathroom where I could think clearly without risk of discovery. The face looking back at me in the mirror was leaner than it had been when I'd left for deployment, marked by the stress lines that came from 15 months of hypervigilance and irregular sleep. But my eyes were alert and focused in a way they hadn't been since before my last tour. The encrypted phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message from my commanding officer confirming my safe arrival and reminding me to check in within 24 hours. Standard procedure for returning personnel. But it gave me an idea. If something happened to me tonight, there would be people asking questions within a day. Marcus's timeline wasn't just about the trust activation. It was about eliminating me before anyone in the military realized I was missing. I opened the phone's secure messaging app and began typing a coded message to my squad leader, Sergeant, First Class Maria Santos. We'd developed our own shorthand during deployment, phrases that would seem innocuous to anyone intercepting communications, but would convey urgent meaning to someone who knew the context. Home situation more complicated than expected. May need backup for personal security assessment. Will update in 12 hours. To anyone monitoring military communications, it would look like a routine check-in from a veteran dealing with readjustment. Stress. But Maria would understand that I was potentially in danger and needed someone aware of my situation. She'd also know to start asking questions if she didn't hear from me by tomorrow morning. The response came back within minutes. Copy that. Guardian Angel protocol activated. Stay frosty. Guardian Angel was our term for emergency backup communications. Maria would be monitoring secure channels and ready to escalate to military police if I sent a distress signal. It wasn't much, but it meant I wasn't completely alone in this fight. Marcus's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my planning. I quickly switched the phone to silent mode and slipped it back into its concealed pocket, then moved quietly back toward the bedroom. If he discovered I was already in the house, I needed to control that revelation carefully. Samantha? His voice carried through the hallway, artificially warm and concerned. Sam, are you home? I thought I heard something upstairs. I had seconds to decide how to play this. Confront him directly with what I'd overheard? Pretend ignorance and try to gather more intelligence? Or attempt to leave immediately and call for help from a secure location? Training and instinct chose for me. Never reveal your capabilities to an enemy until you're ready to use them. Let him think his plan was still working while I gathered more information about the scope of the conspiracy. Up here, I called out, stepping into the bedroom doorway with my duffel bag, trying to look like someone who'd just arrived home. My flight got in early. I was going to surprise you, but you weren't downstairs. The relief that flashed across Marcus's face was immediately replaced by the warm smile I'd fallen in love with 2 years ago. Sam, God, I've missed you so much. He moved toward me with open arms, and every fiber of my being recoiled from accepting his embrace. But maintaining my cover required playing the role of the loving wife who had no idea her husband was planning her murder. His hug felt like being held by a predator, all false warmth concealing deadly intent. You look good, he said, holding me at arm's length to study my face. Tired, but good. How was the flight? I wasn't expecting you until next month. Last-minute orders, I replied, using a cover story I'd prepared during the flight. They needed our unit rotation space for an incoming medical evacuation. I got bumped to emergency transport. It was plausible enough. Military logistics were chaotic enough that early returns happened regularly. Well, I'm glad you're back safe, Marcus said, his hands still on my shoulders. I could feel him assessing me, looking for signs of stress or instability that he could exploit. How are you feeling? Any problems with the readjustment? I know coming home can be tough sometimes. The question felt like a probe, testing whether I was showing symptoms that would support his psychological evaluation narrative. I'm okay, I said carefully. Tired, but glad to be home. It's good to see familiar faces. Have you been taking your medication? The question came with practiced concern, but I caught the subtle emphasis on the word medication. What medication was he referring to? I hadn't been prescribed anything beyond basic pain relievers for a minor injury. My medication? I asked. genuinely confused. "The sleep aids Dr. Morrison prescribed before you left," Marcus said smoothly. "For the nightmares. Don't you remember? You were having trouble sleeping, and he thought the deployment stress might make it worse. I had no memory of any prescription from Dr. Morrison." But Marcus was speaking with such confidence that it made me question my own recollection. Was this how gaslighting worked? The slow erosion of confidence in your own memories and perceptions? "I don't remember picking up any prescription," I said slowly. Marcus's expression shifted to gentle concern mixed with worry. "Sam, we talked about this the night before you left. You were having a particularly bad episode, and Dr. Morrison called in something to help you sleep on the plane. I picked it up for you. It's in the medicine cabinet." He guided me toward the bathroom, keeping one hand on my back in what anyone else would see as a supportive gesture, but I could feel the control in his touch, the way he was steering me exactly where he wanted me to go. The medicine cabinet contained a prescription bottle I'd never seen before, labeled with my name and Dr. Morrison's practice information. "Trazodone 100 milliliters. Take 1 tablet before bedtime for sleep disorders related to PTSD." The bottle was half empty, as if I'd been taking the medication regularly, but I had no memory of ever seeing it before, which meant either my memory was worse than I'd realized, or Marcus and Dr. Morrison had been falsifying medical records and prescriptions in my name. "You don't remember this at all?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with concern that sounded increasingly fake to my ears. "Sam, that's really worrying. Memory problems can be a sign that your PTSD is getting worse." He was trying to make me doubt my own sanity, using my genuine trauma symptoms as leverage to convince me I was losing my grip on reality. How many times had he done this before? How many other women had been slowly convinced they were going crazy while their husbands systematically destroyed their lives? "Maybe I should call Dr. Morrison," Marcus continued. "Get you an emergency appointment tomorrow. He's been really concerned about your psychological state, especially with all the stress from deployment." Tomorrow, the day they'd planned to have me declared incompetent, just hours before my birthday and the trust activation. I needed to play along while gathering more information about their timeline and methods. "Maybe you're right," I said, allowing uncertainty to creep into my voice. "Everything feels foggy since I got back, like I'm not quite all here." The satisfaction that flashed across Marcus's face was quickly hidden, but I caught it. He thought his psychological manipulation was working, that I was beginning to question my own mental stability. "It's okay, baby," he said, wrapping his arms around me again. "We'll get through this together. I've been researching PTSD treatment options while you were gone. There are some really good residential programs that specialize in helping veterans with severe symptoms." Residential programs. Places where I could be isolated from outside contact while they completed whatever medical documentation they needed for the incompetency declaration, or where I could simply disappear entirely if they decided the suicide option was easier to arrange. "Let's get you some rest first," Marcus continued. "You must be exhausted from the flight. Why don't you take a hot shower and I'll make us some dinner? We can talk about everything tomorrow when you're feeling more settled." As he left the bathroom, I stared at the prescription bottle in my hands, my mind racing through the implications. They'd been planning this manipulation for months, creating false medical records and prescriptions to support their eventual claim that I was mentally incompetent. Dr. Morrison had been documenting symptoms I'd never exhibited and prescribing medications I'd never taken, but they'd made several crucial errors in their planning. First, they'd assumed I would take the prescribed medication without question, which would have made me genuinely drowsy and confused, supporting their psychological evaluation. Second, they'd underestimated my military training and ability to recognize when I was under attack. Most importantly, they had no idea that in less than 18 hours, I would have access to resources that could expose and destroy their entire operation. The real question now was whether I could survive until my birthday without revealing that I knew about their plans. Marcus was already moving to accelerate his timeline based on my early return. If he suspected I was aware of the conspiracy, he might abandon the psychological manipulation approach entirely and move directly to violence. But I had advantages he didn't know about: military training, secure communications, and most importantly, the knowledge that the Blackwood family had been protecting itself from predators like him for over a century. The war was far from over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. The shower I took was the longest of my military career, not because I needed to get clean, but because I needed time to process the full scope of what I was facing and plan my next moves. The sound of running water would mask any conversation. I needed to have on my encrypted phone, and Marcus would expect me to take time to decompress after a long deployment. Under the scalding spray, I finally allowed myself to feel the full impact of what I'd discovered. My husband wasn't just stealing from me. He was part of a sophisticated criminal network that had murdered multiple women and stolen billions of dollars. The man I'd shared a bed with for 2 years, who'd held me through nightmares and promised to protect me from the world, was planning to kill me before midnight. But beneath the shock and betrayal, something else was rising: the cold, tactical mindset that had kept me alive through 3 combat deployments. Marcus and his accomplices had made a fundamental error in targeting me. They'd seen my PTSD symptoms and assumed they represented weakness, but anyone who'd served in Afghanistan knew that surviving that kind of deployment required a special kind of strength. I activated my encrypted phone and sent another coded message to Maria Santos. Situation deteriorating rapidly. May need immediate extraction assistance. Personal security compromised. Her response came back within minutes. Backup team on standby. Give me coordinates and timeline. Having military support available was reassuring, but I couldn't risk calling in help until I had more evidence about the conspiracy's scope. If this operation was as large as Marcus's conversation suggested, simply escaping wouldn't solve the problem. They'd disappear, destroy evidence, and continue targeting other victims. The water was beginning to run cold when I heard my phone buzz with an incoming call from an unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something made me check the caller ID. The area code was 406, Montana, where the Blackwood family had originated. Miss Blackwood? The voice was elderly but strong, with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of commanding respect. This is Harrison Mitchell, administrator of the Blackwood Family Trust. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time, but we have some urgent matters to discuss. My heart rate spiked as I realized the implications. If the trust administrator was calling me directly, it meant they were aware of the approaching activation date, but it also meant Marcus's surveillance of my communications might have detected the call. I'm not sure what you're referring to, I said carefully, aware that my phone conversations might be monitored. Of course, Harrison replied smoothly. Perhaps it would be better if we met in person to discuss your family's business interests. Are you available tomorrow morning? I'm flying in from Billings specifically to meet with you. Tomorrow morning was my birthday. Trust activation day. If Harrison was coming to Seattle personally, it meant the Blackwood family took the transition of control very seriously. But it also meant I had to survive the next 12 hours without Marcus realizing that powerful allies were already mobilizing on my behalf. I'm not sure my schedule will permit that, I said, using language that would sound innocuous to anyone listening. I just returned from a business trip and have some personal matters to resolve first. I understand completely, Harrison said, and I could hear the subtle emphasis in his voice. However, I think you'll find our family's resources particularly relevant to any personal challenges you might be facing. Shall we say 10 o'clock at the Fairmont Olympic? I'll be in the governor's suite. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in amazement. The trust administrator wasn't just aware of my situation, he was offering help. The question was how much he knew about Marcus's conspiracy and whether the Blackwood family had been monitoring potential threats to their heir. I finished my shower and wrapped myself in a towel, my mind racing through possibilities. If the Blackwood family had their own security apparatus, they might already be investigating Marcus. But they might also be walking into a trap if they didn't understand the full scope of the criminal network he represented. Marcus was waiting in the bedroom when I emerged, sitting on the edge of the bed with a concerned expression that no longer fooled me for a second. "Feeling better?" he asked, standing to embrace me again. "Much better," I lied, allowing him to hold me while every instinct screamed to pull away. The hot water helped. "Good," he said, his hands moving to my shoulders. "I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier. Maybe we should call Dr. Morrison tonight instead of waiting until tomorrow. I'm really worried about these memory issues." The pressure in his grip increased slightly as he spoke, and I realized he was testing my physical responses, looking for signs of awareness or resistance. If I seemed too alert or suspicious, he might abandon the psychological manipulation approach entirely. "I don't know," I said, injecting uncertainty into my voice. "Maybe I'm just tired from the flight. Everything seems fuzzy right now." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Marcus replied, his voice taking on that practiced tone of gentle concern. "Cognitive problems can be a sign of serious psychological deterioration. Dr. Morrison specifically warned me to watch for confusion and memory loss." He guided me to sit on the bed beside him, keeping one hand on my back in what appeared to be a supportive gesture. But I could feel the control in his touch, the way he was positioning me exactly where he wanted me. "I made an appointment for tomorrow morning," he continued. "Dr. Morrison cleared his schedule because he's concerned about your condition. We need to get you evaluated properly before these symptoms get worse. Tomorrow morning. The same time Harrison Mitchell wanted to meet me at the Fairmont Olympic. Marcus was trying to get me committed for psychological evaluation during the exact window when I was supposed to take control of the trust." "Maybe you're right," I said, allowing my voice to sound smaller and more confused. "I feel like I can't trust my own thoughts anymore." The satisfaction in Marcus's expression was quickly hidden, but I caught the flash of triumph. He thought I was breaking down, becoming malleable enough for him to manipulate into whatever scenario he needed. "It's going to be okay," he said, pulling me closer. "I'm going to take care of everything. You don't need to worry about making any decisions right now. Just focus on resting." But as he held me, I felt something that made my blood run cold. The slight bulge under his shirt that indicated he was carrying a concealed weapon. Marcus had armed himself, which meant he was prepared for the possibility that his psychological manipulation might fail, and he'd need to resort to direct violence. "Why don't you get some sleep?" he suggested, his hand moving to stroke my hair. "I'll bring you some dinner in a little while, and maybe one of those sleep aids Dr. Morrison prescribed. You need proper rest." The sleep aids. If I took the medication he was offering, I'd be genuinely incapacitated and helpless. But if I refused, he might become suspicious about my level of awareness. "That sounds good," I said, settling back against the pillows. "I am really tired." Marcus stood and moved toward the door, but paused to look back at me. "Sam? I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you. Everything I'm doing is because I want to protect you." The words would have been touching if I didn't know they came from a man who was planning to murder me within hours. But they also revealed something important about his psychology. He'd convinced himself that his actions were justified, that he was somehow helping his victims even as he destroyed their lives. After he left, I lay still for several minutes, listening to his movements downstairs. The sound of him opening and closing cabinets suggested he was preparing food, but I could also hear him talking quietly on his phone again, probably updating Sarah about my condition and confirming their timeline for tomorrow's operation. I needed to contact Harrison Mitchell and arrange to meet him tonight instead of tomorrow morning. If the Blackwood family had resources that could help expose this conspiracy, I couldn't risk waiting until my official birthday to access them. but I also needed to be extremely careful about my communications. If Marcus was monitoring my phone or had installed surveillance equipment in the house, any contact with the trust administrator could trigger immediate violence. The encrypted military phone offered one solution, but using it would reveal capabilities that I needed to keep hidden. I needed a way to communicate with Harrison that wouldn't alert Marcus to my awareness of the situation. The solution came from an unexpected source, the prescription bottle Marcus had shown me earlier. If I could make him believe I was taking the sleep medication while actually remaining alert, I might be able to convince him that his psychological manipulation was working while secretly coordinating with potential allies. The challenge was surviving the next 12 hours without making any mistakes that would expose my awareness of his plans. Marcus was armed, dangerous, and operating under a deadline that made him increasingly unpredictable. But I had one advantage he didn't know about. Tomorrow wasn't just my 30th birthday. It was the day I would inherit resources and connections that could destroy his entire network. I just had to live long enough to claim them. The smell of Marcus cooking dinner drifted upstairs, a domestic scene that would have seemed normal if I didn't know he was preparing what he intended to be my last meal. I used the noise from the kitchen to mask my movements as I carefully examined our bedroom for surveillance equipment, using techniques I'd learned during counterintelligence training in Afghanistan. What I found chilled me to the bone. A tiny camera lens hidden in the smoke detector, positioned to monitor the entire room. Audio recording devices concealed in the baseboards near the bed and dresser. Marcus hadn't just been planning to steal my money, he'd been documenting my behavior for months, probably building a video record of my supposed psychological deterioration. But the surveillance equipment also gave me an opportunity. If Marcus was monitoring my behavior remotely, I could use that to my advantage by performing exactly the kind of confusion and disorientation he expected to see. I moved to the dresser where I'd seen him access his laptop earlier, making sure my actions were visible to the hidden camera, opening drawers randomly, touching objects as if I couldn't remember what they were, sitting on the edge of the bed with my head in my hands like someone struggling with memory problems. The performance wasn't entirely acting. The stress of discovering my husband's betrayal was genuinely affecting my ability to think clearly, and the adrenaline from knowing my life was in immediate danger made it easy to appear agitated and confused. My encrypted phone vibrated silently. In its concealed pocket, another message from Maria Santos. Guardian Angel reports unusual activity around your residence. Multiple vehicles conducting surveillance. Recommend immediate extraction. Multiple vehicles. Marcus's network was already positioning assets around our house, probably preparing for whatever scenario they'd planned for tonight. If Maria's reconnaissance team had spotted them, it meant I was already surrounded by hostile operatives. I typed back carefully, "Cannot extract immediately. Gathering critical intelligence on major criminal operation. Need 12 hours minimum." Her response was immediate. Negative. Situation too dangerous. Military police en route to establish security perimeter. My heart sank as I realized the implications. If military police arrived at the house, Marcus would know immediately that I'd contacted outside help. He'd abandon any pretense of psychological manipulation and move directly to violence, probably claiming I'd suffered a psychotic break and attacked him in self-defense. I needed to stop the military intervention without alerting Marcus to my communications with the outside world. But first, I had to understand exactly what resources were available to me through the Blackwood Family Trust. Using my phone's secure browser, I accessed the Trust's official website for the first time in years. What I found was far more extensive than I'd ever imagined. The Blackwood Family Trust wasn't just a passive investment portfolio. It was a comprehensive organization that included legal teams, security services, investigative specialists, and crisis management experts. The emergency contact section listed Harrison Mitchell's direct number along with a 24-hour crisis hotline, but it also included something I hadn't expected: A secure messaging system that could be accessed through encrypted channels without leaving traces on normal communication networks. I activated the secure messaging system and typed carefully. Samantha Blackwood requesting immediate emergency assistance. Life-threatening situation involving conspiracy to steal trust assets. Currently under surveillance by hostile operatives. Need support before official activation tomorrow. The response came back within minutes. Emergency protocol activated. Crisis team deploying to Seattle immediately. Maintain current position and avoid detection. Do not attempt to leave residence until contact established. Support assets en route. Harrison Mitchell's second message was even more specific. Missy Blackwood, we have been monitoring potential threats to trust heirs for several years. Your husband's activities have been under investigation since shortly after your marriage. Stand by for immediate assistance. They'd been watching Marcus. The Blackwood family had known about the conspiracy against me and had been building a case for months. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had allies who understood exactly what I was facing, but I still needed to manage the immediate crisis. Marcus's footsteps on the stairs indicated he was bringing dinner, probably laced with whatever drug he planned to use to incapacitate me. I had to convince him that his psychological manipulation was working while avoiding any substance that would actually compromise my ability to defend myself. Sam, Marcus called softly as he approached the bedroom. I brought you some soup and your medication. You need to keep your strength up. He entered carrying a tray with a bowl of soup, crackers, and a glass of water with a small white pill beside it. The meal looked innocent enough, but I knew better than to trust anything he prepared. Thank you, I said, accepting the tray with hands that I allowed to shake slightly. I'm sorry I'm being so difficult. Everything just feels wrong somehow. You're not being difficult, Marcus replied, sitting on the edge of the bed beside me. You're sick, and that's not your fault. The important thing is getting you the help you need. I took a small sip of the soup, tasting it carefully for any unusual flavors or textures. It seemed normal, but I made sure to eat very little while appearing to consume more than I actually did. The medication was a different challenge. I needed to make Marcus believe I'd taken it without actually ingesting whatever drug it contained. Dr. Morrison said this would help with the anxiety and confusion, Marcus explained, indicating the white pill. It's a mild sedative that should help you sleep peacefully tonight. I palmed the pill while pretending to put it in my mouth, then took a drink of water while making sure the medication remained hidden in my hand. I do feel calmer already, I said, allowing my voice to become slightly slurred as if the drug was taking effect. Marcus's expression showed satisfaction mixed with what might have been genuine regret. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like the man I'd fallen in love with, someone who might actually feel sorry about what he was doing to me. I need you to know that I never wanted it to come to this, he said quietly. When I first met you, the plan was just business. But then I got to know you, and I started to care about you. The confession was probably meant to ease his own guilt rather than provide me with comfort, but it revealed something important about his psychology. Marcus wasn't a complete sociopath. He was capable of forming emotional attachments, which meant he might be vulnerable to manipulation himself. What plan? I asked, injecting confusion into my voice. Marcus, you're scaring me. What are you talking about? His face immediately shifted back to concerned innocence. Nothing, baby. I'm just talking nonsense. The stress of worrying about you has me saying things that don't make sense. But the momentary lapse had given me insight into his mental state. He was conflicted about what he was doing, which meant he might hesitate at a crucial moment if I could exploit that emotional connection. I love you too, I said, reaching out to touch his hand. Whatever's wrong, we can work through it together. The pain that flashed across his features was genuine, and for a brief moment I wondered if there was any possibility of reaching the man I'd married underneath the criminal persona he'd adopted. But then his expression hardened again, and I saw the cold calculation return to his eyes. Try to get some sleep, he said, standing up from the bed. "I'll check on you in a few hours." As he left the room, I heard him speaking quietly into his phone again. "She's taken the sedative. Should be unconscious within 30 minutes. Confirm the cleanup team is ready for midnight execution." Cleanup team. They weren't just planning to kill me. They were planning to stage an elaborate scene that would pass forensic examination. How many times had they done this before? How many other women had died in carefully orchestrated suicides while their husbands played the role of grieving widowers? I waited until I heard Marcus move to the downstairs office before checking my secure messages again. Harrison Mitchell had sent detailed instructions. "Crisis team in position around perimeter. Do not be alarmed by activity outside residence. We are coordinating with federal law enforcement to gather evidence before intervention. Maintain current status until 200 hours unless immediate danger threatens." Federal law enforcement. The Blackwood family had enough influence to mobilize FBI resources in response to threats against their heir. But they were waiting until 2 a.m., which meant I had to survive another 4 hours while pretending to be unconscious and vulnerable. My military phone showed another message from Maria Santos. "Military police standing down per federal request. Alternative support available if needed. Stay alive, soldier." The coordination between my military contacts and the Blackwood crisis team was impressive, but it also raised the stakes considerably. If federal agents were building a case against Marcus's network, they'd need evidence that would hold up in court. That meant allowing the conspiracy to advance far enough to document criminal intent while stopping short of actual harm. I was going to spend the next 4 hours playing dead while surrounded by people who wanted to kill me, waiting for help. That might not arrive in time if something went wrong. But I had one advantage that neither Marcus nor his accomplices knew about. I wasn't the traumatized, helpless veteran they thought they were targeting. I was a combat-trained soldier with backup support and resources they couldn't imagine. The next 4 hours would determine whether the Blackwood family legacy would continue or whether Marcus's network would claim another victim. Either way, the waiting was over. The final battle was about to begin. At 11:47 p.m., I heard the front door open with the soft click of someone using a key rather than knocking. Through the bedroom's surveillance camera that I now knew was there, I maintained the appearance of deep drug-induced sleep while listening to multiple sets of footsteps enter our house. Marcus's voice carried up the stairs, speaking in the low, professional tones of someone conducting business. "She's been unconscious for 3 hours, he reported. "Vitals are steady, breathing is deep and regular. The sedative should keep her under for at least another 6 hours, which gives us plenty of time to stage everything properly." A woman's voice responded, Sarah, whom I now recognized from the phone conversations. "Excellent. Dr. Morrison's final report is complete. Severe PTSD with acute psychotic episodes, history of violent outbursts, access to military weapons, and a documented pattern of increasingly erratic behavior. The suicide narrative will be completely believable. More footsteps, along with the sound of equipment being moved. I caught glimpses through barely opened eyelids of figures in dark clothing, setting up what appeared to be cameras and lighting equipment. They were planning to document my death, probably to create evidence that would support their cover story. "Where's the weapon?" another male voice asked. "We need something consistent with military training but also accessible in a moment of psychological crisis." "Her service pistol is in the gun safe downstairs," Marcus replied. "I have the combination. We'll stage it as an impulsive decision during a severe PTSD episode. She woke up disoriented, accessed her weapon, and, well, the rest will be obvious. My Beretta M9, the sidearm I'd carried through 3 deployments in Afghanistan. They were planning to use my own weapon against me, adding another layer of psychological violation to their scheme. The gun that had protected me through countless dangerous missions would become the instrument of my destruction. The timing needs to be perfect, Sarah continued. Marcus makes the 911 call at exactly 12:30 a.m., reporting that he woke up to the sound of a gunshot. Paramedics arrived to find a tragic scene, a troubled veteran who couldn't cope with the transition to civilian life. What about the trust? Activation? The third voice asked. Does her death before midnight prevent the inheritance transfer? Actually, that's the beautiful part, Marcus replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. The trust activates based on birth date, not time of death. She legally inherits at 12:01 a.m., but dies 30 minutes later before she can access any of the funds. That creates a brief window where she's the rightful heir, which makes the subsequent inheritance claims much more complicated to challenge. They'd researched every legal angle, planning not just my murder, but the optimal timing to maximize their ability to claim my inheritance afterward. The precision of their planning was terrifying, but it also revealed something important. They were confident enough in their control of the situation to discuss details openly. Through my encrypted phone, which I'd hidden under my pillow, I could feel the vibration of incoming messages. Harrison Mitchell and his crisis team were monitoring the situation, but they needed evidence of criminal intent before they could intervene. My role was to remain passive while gathering intelligence that would destroy the entire network. Begin setup, Sarah instructed. I want everything recorded from multiple angles. If there are any questions later about the circumstances, we need documentation that supports the psychological break narrative. I heard the sound of professional camera equipment being positioned around the bedroom. They weren't just planning to kill me, they were creating a propaganda film that would serve as evidence for their cover story. How many other murders had they documented this way? The most chilling moment came when Marcus approached the bed where I lay pretending to be unconscious. "I'm sorry, Sam," he whispered, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine emotion. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted, but there's too much money at stake to walk away now." His hand touched my forehead gently, the same gesture he'd used to comfort me during nightmares over the past 2 years. Even knowing what he was planning, some part of me responded to that familiar touch. The psychological manipulation had been so complete that my body still associated his presence with safety and comfort. "She really is beautiful," Sarah observed from across the room. "It's almost a shame to waste her. Maybe we should consider the trafficking option for future targets. Pretty military women would bring premium prices in certain markets." Trafficking. They weren't just murderers and thieves, they were involved in human trafficking as well. How many women had disappeared into that horror because of this network? The scope of their crimes kept expanding with every revelation. "Too risky," Marcus replied. "Missing persons investigations for military personnel are too thorough. Death is cleaner, especially when we can control the narrative." At 12:01 a.m., my encrypted phone vibrated with a message from Harrison Mitchell. "Trust activation complete. You now have full legal authority over Blackwood family resources. Crisis team ready for intervention on your signal." I was now officially worth $300 million and had access to resources that Marcus couldn't even imagine. But I was also surrounded by armed criminals who were minutes away from murdering me. The timing of my rescue would have to be perfect. "Final weapons check," the third voice instructed. "Marcus, you'll handle the primary action. Sarah and I will manage documentation and cleanup. Remember, this needs to look like an impulsive suicide, not an execution." I heard the distinctive sound of my Beretta being removed from its case and the mechanical click of a round being chambered. My own weapon, loaded with ammunition I'd carried through combat zones, was now pointed at my head by the man I'd trusted with my life. "Any last words for the camera?" Sarah asked mockingly. "Something about the horrors of war and the difficulty of readjustment? It would add authenticity to the final recording." "She's unconscious," Marcus pointed out. "How would she speak?" "We wake her up for the final scene," Sarah replied coldly. "A few slaps, some ammonia under her nose. She regains consciousness just long enough to realize what's happening. The terror and confusion will look perfect on camera, exactly what you'd expect from someone having a psychotic break." They were planning to wake me up before killing me. to capture my genuine fear and horror for their propaganda footage. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but it also gave me an opportunity. If they needed me conscious for the final scene, I had a window to act. My hand moved slowly to the encrypted phone hidden under my pillow, typing a simple message to Harrison Mitchell. Execute rescue. Immediate lethal threat. Multiple armed. Hostiles in bedroom. The response came back instantly. Confirmed. Federal agents breaching in 60 seconds. Take cover. 60 seconds. I had to remain motionless for one more minute while listening to my murderers plan the final details of my death. The Beretta was still pointed at my head, and Marcus's finger was on the trigger. If something went wrong with the rescue timing, I would die with help literally seconds away. Begin revival protocol, Sarah instructed. I want her awake and aware for the final sequence. Marcus approached the bed with what looked like smelling salts, preparing to wake me up for my own execution. This was the moment when I had to choose between maintaining my cover and defending myself. But before he could reach me, the sound of shattering glass erupted from downstairs as federal agents breached the house simultaneously through multiple entry points. Shouts of FBI federal agents echoed through the hallway, followed by the thunder of tactical boots on stairs. "What the hell?" Sarah began, but her words were cut off as the bedroom door exploded inward. The rescue had begun, but I was still surrounded by armed criminals with loaded weapons. The next 30 seconds would determine whether I survived to claim my inheritance or died in the crossfire between my would-be murderers and the federal agents trying to save me. The final battle for the Blackwood legacy was happening in my own bedroom, with me caught in the middle between justice and death. The bedroom erupted into chaos as federal agents in tactical gear poured through the doorway, their weapons trained on Marcus and his accomplices. But in that first crucial second, Marcus still had my Beretta pointed at my head, his finger tightening on the trigger as he realized his carefully planned operation was collapsing. "Drop your weapon!" Agent Patricia Vance shouted from the doorway, her voice cutting through the confusion with unmistakable authority. "Federal agents! Nobody moves!" But Marcus was already moving, swinging the pistol toward the agents while Sarah dove for a bag that I now realized contained additional weapons. The third conspirator, a lean man with cold eyes, had produced a submachine gun from somewhere and was bringing it to bear on the federal team. Training kicked in automatically. Rolling off the bed away from Marcus's weapon, I hit the floor hard and scrambled for cover behind the heavy oak dresser my grandmother had given me as a wedding gift. The irony wasn't lost on me that furniture paid for with Blackwood money was now protecting the last Blackwood heir from assassination. The first gunshots were deafeningly loud in the confined space of the bedroom. Marcus fired twice at the federal agents before Agent Vance's return fire caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending my Beretta clattering across the hardwood floor. "Sam's awake!" Sarah screamed, apparently abandoning any pretense that this was a suicide scene. "She's been conscious the whole time. She set us up." More federal agents flooded into the room as the firefight intensified. Sarah had retrieved an automatic pistol from her equipment bag and was firing rapidly at anything that moved, while the third conspirator had taken cover behind the bed and was laying down suppressing fire with his submachine gun. From my position, behind the dresser, I could see my Beretta lying in the middle of the floor between the federal agents and the criminals. If I could reach it, I'd have a weapon and could help end this standoff, but getting to it meant crossing open ground under hostile fire. "Samantha Blackwood," Agent Vance called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "Are you injured? Can you respond?" "I'm okay," I shouted back. "3 hostiles. Marcus has shoulder wound but still mobile. Unknown number of additional weapons." The tactical situation assessment came automatically. Years of combat experience translating civilian surroundings into battlefield terrain. The bedroom had 2 windows that could serve as escape routes, multiple pieces of furniture providing cover and concealment, and limited entry points that favored the defenders. But these weren't insurgents in Afghanistan. They were criminals. who'd spent years avoiding law enforcement through careful planning and superior resources. Sarah had moved to a position behind the heavy wooden armoire, using it as cover while she changed magazines with practiced efficiency. "We have backup extraction routes," she called to her remaining accomplice. "Abort primary mission. Execute. Emergency protocol." Emergency protocol apparently meant eliminating all witnesses. The third conspirator swung his submachine gun toward my position, and I barely managed to roll deeper behind the dresser before bullets splintered the wood where my head had been moments earlier. That's when I heard a sound that made my heart soar, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors approaching the house. Harrison Mitchell's crisis team wasn't just providing ground support. They'd brought air assets to prevent the criminals from escaping. "Federal aviation units establishing perimeter," Agent Vance announced, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "All escape routes compromised. Surrender now and you'll live to see trial." But Sarah and her accomplice weren't planning to surrender. Through the bedroom window, I could see rappelling lines dropping from a helicopter and more federal agents were preparing to breach through the second-story windows. The criminals were about to be completely surrounded. "Take the air!" Sarah screamed to her partner. "If we can't complete the primary mission, she's our ticket out of here." The man with the submachine gun immediately shifted his fire pattern, laying down covering shots while moving toward my position. He intended to take me hostage, using my life as leverage to negotiate an escape. But he'd made a crucial tactical error. In focusing on capturing me, he'd exposed himself to Agent Vance's line of fire. Her shot took him center mass, and he dropped behind the bed with a gurgling cry that suggested the wound was fatal. That left only Sarah, but she was the most dangerous of the three. While Marcus had been motivated primarily by greed and his unknown accomplice had been following orders, Sarah was the operational mastermind who'd orchestrated murders across multiple states. She had nothing to lose and every reason to take as many people with her as possible. "You think you've won?" Sarah called out, her voice taking on a manic edge. "You have no idea how deep this network goes. We have operations in 12 states. Dozens of targets already in progress. Killing me won't stop anything." She was probably trying to distract the federal agents while maneuvering for a better position, but her words revealed the true scope of what we were fighting. This wasn't just about my inheritance. It was about dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been systematically murdering wealthy Americans for years. More federal agents rappelled through the bedroom windows, their tactical entry perfectly coordinated with the ground team. Within seconds, Sarah found herself surrounded by professional operators who dealt with far more dangerous situations than a cornered financial predator. "Last chance," Agent Vance announced. "Drop your weapon and surrender, or we end this now." Sarah's response was to empty her remaining ammunition in a wild spray that accomplished nothing except confirming her intent to fight to the death. The federal agent's return fire was precise and overwhelming. When the shooting stopped, Sarah Morrison lay motionless behind the armoire, her reign of terror permanently ended. The sudden silence in the bedroom was almost as shocking as the violence had been. My ears were ringing from the gunfire, and the air was thick with cordite smoke. But the immediate threat was over. Marcus lay groaning on the floor, clutching his wounded shoulder, but very much alive to face trial. His two accomplices were dead. Their carefully planned operation destroyed by the very surveillance and documentation they'd intended to use against me. "Medical team to the second floor," Agent Vance called into her radio. "We need paramedics for wounded suspects and wellness. Check on the protected witness. Protected witness." I was no longer just Samantha Blackwood, struggling veteran and target of financial predators. I was now the key witness in what would become the largest financial crimes prosecution in recent history, with resources and protection that reflected my new status as heir to the Blackwood fortune. Harrison Mitchell appeared in the bedroom doorway, somehow managing to look perfectly composed despite the chaos of the raid. Distinguished, gray-haired, and wearing an expensive suit that hadn't been wrinkled by crawling through tactical operations, he surveyed the scene with the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. Miss Blackwood," he said, approaching, my position behind the dresser. "I'm Harrison Mitchell, administrator of your family's trust. I apologize for the dramatic circumstances of our first meeting, but I'm pleased to confirm that you've successfully reached your 30th birthday and assumed full control of the Blackwood legacy." The formality of his words, delivered in a bedroom that looked like a war zone, struck me as surreal. But there was something deeply reassuring about his presence, the sense that I was no longer fighting this battle alone, that I now had access to resources and support that matched the sophistication of the enemies I'd faced. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire. "How long have you known about the conspiracy?" "We've been monitoring potential threats to Blackwood heirs for several years," Harrison replied. "Your husband's activities came to our attention shortly after your marriage, but we needed sufficient evidence to ensure that the entire network could be dismantled rather than simply scattered. As paramedics attended to Marcus and federal agents secured the crime scene, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. Taking control of a $300 million trust was only the beginning. Now I had to help prosecute the criminals who'd tried to steal it, protect other potential victims, and figure out what to do with resources I'd never imagined possessing. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The Blackwood legacy had survived another attempt at destruction, and now it was my responsibility to ensure it would continue protecting future generations. The war for my inheritance was over. Now the work of justice could begin. 6 months after the raid that saved my life, I stood in the boardroom of Blackwood Enterprises' newly renovated headquarters in downtown Seattle, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The building itself was a testament to how dramatically my life had changed. Instead of the cramped duplex where Marcus had planned my murder, I now operated from a gleaming tower that housed one of the most powerful private investigation and victim advocacy organizations in the Pacific Northwest. The transformation hadn't been just physical. The woman who'd returned from Afghanistan struggling with PTSD and financial insecurity had evolved into someone who commanded resources that most people couldn't even comprehend. But more importantly, I'd discovered that the Blackwood legacy wasn't just about preserving wealth. It was about using that wealth to protect others from the kind of predators who'd nearly destroyed me. Agent Patricia Vance entered the boardroom, carrying a thick folder that I knew contained updates on the nationwide investigation that had grown out of my case. Over the past 6 months, she'd become more than just the federal agent who'd saved my life. She'd become a trusted ally in the larger war we were fighting against financial predators. "The Portland grand jury returned indictments this morning," she announced, setting the folder on the conference table. 12 additional members of the network, including 2 doctors, 3 lawyers, and a state court judge who'd been signing off on fraudulent competency hearings. 12 more conspirators. The scope of the criminal enterprise kept expanding with each new investigation. What had started as my personal fight for survival had revealed a nationwide network of corruption that reached into hospitals, courtrooms, and financial institutions across multiple states. "What about the victims' families?" I asked, settling into the chair at the head of the table, a position I still wasn't entirely comfortable with, but one I'd learned to accept as part of my new responsibilities. "That's where the news gets better," Agent Vance replied, opening the folder to reveal photographs of men and women whose faces I'd studied extensively over the past months. "We've identified 37 confirmed victims over the past 8 years, and the asset recovery operation has been more successful than anyone anticipated." The asset recovery operation was something I'd insisted on from the beginning. It wasn't enough to prosecute the criminals who'd stolen from murdered victims. We needed to return those stolen assets to the families who'd been deprived of their rightful inheritances. Harrison Mitchell had initially been skeptical about the complexity and cost of such an undertaking, but I'd made it clear that using Blackwood resources to help other victims wasn't optional. My family's fortune was built by people who fought to protect what was theirs, I'd told him during one of our early planning sessions. If we don't help these families get justice, we're no better than the people who tried to steal from us. The DI results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Working with federal investigators and the Blackwood Trust's legal team, we'd recovered over $200 million in stolen assets and returned them to families who'd thought their loved ones' deaths had left them with nothing. The Chen family in Portland received their full settlement yesterday. Agent Vance continued. Jennifer Chen's inheritance that the network stole has been recovered with interest, plus damages for the emotional trauma. Her cousins will be able to send their children to college and pay off their mortgages. Jennifer Chen, the woman whose murder Marcus had mentioned so casually during his phone conversation. Learning about her life, her work as a pediatric nurse, her volunteer efforts with homeless veterans, the family who'd mourned her supposed suicide, had made the broader mission personal in a way that transcended my own experience. What? About the ongoing investigations? I asked. Are we still finding new victims? 3 more cases this week, Agent Vance replied grimly. A widow in Denver whose financial advisor disappeared with her retirement savings. A businessman in Miami whose new wife seems remarkably similar to the women in this network. An elderly man in Phoenix whose caregiver has been systematically isolating him from family members. Each new case reinforced the reality that dismantling this network was an ongoing battle rather than a single victory. The criminals we'd arrested had been part of a larger ecosystem of financial predators who viewed wealthy, vulnerable individuals as resources to be harvested. But we'd also developed capabilities that matched their sophistication. The Blackwood Victim Protection Initiative, which I'd established with $50 million in trust funds, now employed former federal agents, financial crimes specialists, and victim advocates who could identify and stop these schemes before they claimed new victims. Dr. Sarah Chen had joined our team as Director of Psychological Services, bringing expertise in recognizing the trauma patterns that financial predators exploited. We're seeing the same manipulation techniques across dozens of cases, she'd explained during her first briefing. These criminals have weaponized therapy and medical care, using people's genuine mental health struggles against them. The betrayal? By Dr. Morrison, my own therapist, had been particularly devastating to process. Working with Dr. Chen, I'd learned to separate the legitimate trauma I was dealing with from the manufactured psychological profile that Morrison had created to support the conspiracy against me. Your PTSD symptoms were real, Dr. Chen had assured me during one of our sessions. Your struggles with readjustment, your nightmares, your hypervigilance, those were genuine responses to combat trauma. What Morrison did was take those real symptoms and exaggerate them into a fictional narrative of incompetence and danger. The distinction mattered more than I'd initially realized. Part of my healing process involved understanding that my military service and combat experience weren't weaknesses to be exploited. They were sources of strength that had ultimately saved my life and enabled me to fight back. Harrison Mitchell knocked on the boardroom door and entered with his usual air of calm authority. Over the past 6 months, he'd become much more than just a trust administrator. He'd evolved into something like a mentor, helping me understand the full scope of my family's legacy and my responsibilities as its steward. The Seattle Times wants to do a feature story about the Victim Recovery Program, he announced. They're particularly interested in the technological innovations we've developed for tracking financial crimes. The technological innovations were something I was particularly proud of. Working with cybersecurity experts and financial analysts, we'd created monitoring systems that could detect the early signs of the systematic asset stripping that characterized these criminal networks. Banks, investment firms, and insurance companies are implementing our detection algorithms, Harrison continued. We're identifying suspicious patterns months before they would have been noticed through traditional oversight. But the most meaningful change was personal. The nightmares that had plagued me for years after my combat deployments had gradually decreased as I'd found a sense of purpose that matched the intensity of my military service. Fighting financial predators wasn't exactly the same as fighting insurgents in Afghanistan, but it required similar skills and provided similar satisfaction when operations succeeded. Maria Santos had visited the previous month, officially representing the Army's interest in veteran support programs, but primarily checking on her former squad member. "You look different," she'd observed during our private conversation. "More like the soldier I knew before the last deployment. Like you've found your mission again." She was right. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I felt like I was fighting for something that mattered, using skills and resources to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The Blackwood fortune had given me the means to wage war against an enemy that most people didn't even know existed. "There's one more update," Agent Vance said, pulling a single photograph from the folder. "We arrested Sarah Morrison's operational supervisor in Chicago yesterday, Elena Volkov, the woman who'd been coordinating financial predator networks across the Midwest." Elena Volkov's arrest represented a major breakthrough in dismantling the command structure that had enabled these crimes to continue for so long. But it also revealed how much work remained to be done. "How many more networks are out there?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the full answer. "Probably dozens," Agent Vance replied honestly. "But here's what's different now. They know we're hunting them. The Blackwood Initiative has changed the risk-reward calculation for financial predators across the country. They can no longer assume their victims will be isolated and helpless." As the meeting concluded, and I prepared for the evening's events, a gala fundraiser for veteran support services, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. A year ago, I'd been a struggling veteran living paycheck to paycheck, trusting the wrong man and vulnerable to predators I didn't even know existed. Now I controlled resources that most people couldn't imagine, commanded the respect of federal law enforcement agencies, and had discovered a mission that gave my life meaning beyond anything I'd experienced since leaving the military. The Blackwood legacy had survived another attempt at destruction, but more importantly, it had evolved into something that could protect future generations from the threats I'd faced. 2 years after the night that changed everything, I stood at the podium of the Blackwood Center for Financial Justice, looking out at an audience that represented the culmination of everything I'd fought to achieve. Federal agents, victim advocates, survivors of financial crimes, and law enforcement officials from across the country had gathered for the center's second annual conference on combating organized financial predation. But the most meaningful faces in the audience were those of the families we'd helped. People like the Chen family from Portland, whose lives had been shattered by Jennifer's murder, but who'd found healing through justice and financial recovery. Children who would go to college because we'd recovered their murdered parents' stolen inheritances. Elderly victims who'd escaped predatory caregivers before losing everything they'd worked their lives to build. When I returned from my final deployment in Afghanistan, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. I thought the most dangerous enemies I'd ever face were behind me. I had no idea that the greatest threat to my life and future would come from the man I'd married, the doctor I'd trusted with my trauma, and a network of criminals who'd turned murder into a business model. The story I told wasn't easy to hear, but it was necessary. In the 2 years since Marcus's arrest and trial, we'd learned that financial predation was far more widespread and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The criminals who'd targeted me weren't aberrations. They were part of a systematic problem that affected thousands of families across the country. The Heritage Group, as they called themselves, had stolen over $400 million from murdered victims before we stopped them, I continued. But more importantly, they'd perfected techniques that dozens of other criminal networks were copying and adapting. What happened to me was happening to vulnerable people in every state, every month, with very few survivors to tell their stories. Agent Patricia Vance had provided the most recent statistics during her morning presentation. In the 2 years since our investigation began, federal authorities had identified and dismantled 17 separate financial predation networks, arrested over 200 conspirators, and recovered more than $800 million in stolen assets. But the numbers that mattered most to me were different. 37 families had received full restitution for their murdered loved ones' stolen inheritances. 63 potential victims had been identified and protected before becoming targets. Hundreds of vulnerable individuals had been educated about the warning signs of financial predation and equipped with resources to protect themselves. The Blackwood Center for Financial Justice now operates in 12 states, I announced, with partnerships that include federal law enforcement, state banking authorities, and victim advocacy organizations. But our most important partnerships are with the survivors and families who've turned their own experiences with financial predation into missions to protect others. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd become the center's director of victim services, had developed training programs that were now standard curriculum at FBI academies and police departments nationwide. Understanding the psychology of financial predators is crucial, she'd explained during her earlier presentation. These criminals don't just steal money, they weaponize trust, love, and vulnerability. Teaching people to recognize those tactics saves lives. The technological initiatives had been equally successful. The financial monitoring systems we'd developed were now used by banks and investment firms across the country, creating an early warning network that could detect suspicious patterns before victims lost significant assets. In the past year alone, I continued, our monitoring systems have prevented an estimated $200 million in theft attempts and identified over 300 individuals who were being targeted by financial predators. Technology has become our force multiplier, allowing us to protect far more people than we could reach through traditional investigation alone. But perhaps the most important development had been the creation of what we called the Survivor Network, a confidential support system that connected people who'd experienced financial predation with others who understood their trauma. 2. Many victims felt isolated and ashamed, believing they'd been foolish to trust the wrong people. Financial predation isn't a crime that happens to weak or stupid people, I emphasized, looking directly at several survivors in the audience. It happens to successful, intelligent individuals who've been targeted by sophisticated criminals. The shame belongs entirely to the predators, not their victims. Marcus's trial had been a media sensation, but for me it had been more about closure than justice. Watching him sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole had provided satisfaction, but the real victory was knowing that his network would never hurt anyone else. His final statement to the court had revealed the twisted psychology that enabled these crimes. I never intended for anyone to get hurt, he'd claimed. I just saw opportunities and took them. If people were careless with their security, that wasn't my fault. Even facing decades in prison, he couldn't acknowledge the humanity of his victims, or accept responsibility for the lives he'd destroyed. But that lack of empathy had ultimately been his weakness. It prevented him from understanding the determination and resources that victims like me could bring to bear when we fought back. The personal transformation had been as dramatic as the professional mission. Working with Dr. Chen, I'd learned to integrate my combat trauma with my civilian experiences in ways that made both sources of strength rather than vulnerability. The hypervigilance that had once made crowded spaces uncomfortable now helped me identify threats and protect others. The leadership skills I'd developed in Afghanistan translated perfectly to managing complex operations against sophisticated enemies. Most importantly, I'd found a sense of purpose that matched the intensity and meaning of my military service. The Blackwood fortune had given me resources, but the mission had given me direction. The war against financial predation is far from over, I concluded, looking out at faces that represented law enforcement, advocacy, and survivor communities. New networks emerge constantly, adapting their techniques and finding new ways to exploit vulnerable people. But they now face coordinated opposition that matches their sophistication and exceeds their resources. The standing ovation that followed wasn't for me personally. It was for everyone in that room who'd chosen to fight back against criminals who counted on their victims remaining silent and isolated. Federal agents who'd dedicated their careers to financial crimes. Advocates who worked with traumatized families. survivors who'd transformed their own experiences into missions to protect others. As the conference concluded and attendees began networking and planning future collaborations, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. The struggling veteran who'd returned from Afghanistan 2 years ago could never have imagined commanding the resources and respect that came with the Blackwood legacy. But more than that, I'd discovered that survival wasn't enough. True victory meant ensuring that the predators who'd targeted me could never hurt anyone else, and that future victims would have resources and support that I'd been forced to fight for alone. Harrison Mitchell approached as the auditorium emptied, carrying a folder that I knew contained updates on our latest investigations. 3 more potential networks identified this week, he reported, but also 3 successful interventions that prevented targeting from advancing to the theft stage. The work would never end, but that was exactly as it should be. The Blackwood family had built their fortune by fighting to protect what was theirs. Now that fortune protected people across the country who faced the same threats that had nearly destroyed me. Ready for the next mission? Harrison asked with the slight smile that indicated he already knew my answer. Always, I replied, accepting the folder and beginning to review our latest intelligence on financial predators who thought they could operate without consequences. They were about to learn what happened when they targeted the wrong family and underestimated the wrong woman. The Blackwood legacy would continue, stronger and more determined than ever, protecting future generations from threats they might never see coming. The war for my inheritance had become a war for justice itself, and we were winning. If this story resonated with you, and you want to hear more incredible tales of survival, justice, and people fighting back against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you real stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when their backs were against the wall. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours. Your story might inspire our next video. Thanks for being part of our community of survivors and fighters. Together, we're stronger than any predator who thinks they can take advantage of the vulnerable.